This is the You Can Learn Chinese podcast, part of the Sinica Network from the China Project. For everyone who's trying to learn Chinese or reaching for the next level, you came to the right place. I'm your host, Jared Turner, co-founder of the Mandarin Companion Graded Reader Series, longtime resident of China, and I try to be self-depreciating, but I'm not very good at it. My co-host is John Paston, co-founder of Mandarin Companion, founder of All Set Learning, the Chinese Grammar Wiki, Sinosplice.com, and if his last name was Pepper, he would have definitely gone to medical school. How do we get the set of Chinese words we have today? In this episode, John and I are going to talk about how the Chinese language has evolved, adapted, innovated, and borrowed to create the language it is today. Guest interview is with Krystal Wu, a heritage Cantonese speaker from England who later in her life decided to branch out and learn Mandarin Chinese. Let's get to it. Hey guys, this is Jared Turner coming at you from Utah in the United States.
Hi there, everybody. Happy 2023. I am John Pasden, and I am in Shanghai, China.
Well, to start off, we did not have an episode 2 weeks ago. John, that's our first episode we've missed in almost 4 years.
It's been a while, but, it was the holidays, and I had just gotten COVID, finally. I know I'm late to that party, but, just like everyone else in Shanghai and Beijing at the end of 2022, I got COVID, and then it was Christmas.
That's right. So we had some crazy stuff going down. And how are you and your family, John? Have you guys recovered from COVID?
Yeah, we're mostly recovered. I wouldn't say 100%. It kind of really just persists, doesn't it? But, we're over it, and we are very happy that hopefully China is moving on from COVID and life can be interesting again.
All right. I look forward to coming out again this year, John.
Coming to China, you mean?
Yes, to China.
All right. China welcomes you. Okay, so today's episode is a little bit about Chinese vocabulary and what to expect. And this might validate some of the feelings that you had about learning Chinese vocabulary when you first started learning Chinese, or maybe you're having them now. I think Jared and we have similar feelings on this challenge of breaking into Chinese vocabulary.
It's hard. I think there's the linguistic term cognates. There's none, very, very few for us native English speakers and others from Latin-based languages. It's just, it's a bit challenging to get into. It's something that's so very unfamiliar.
Yeah, and to use the example of English, if you're a native English speaker, Old English, has roots in the Germanic languages, and then English has tons of French in it, French loanwords, which some people think is just Latin, but actually it came from French and, before that Latin. But because of all these, different European loanwords, it makes learning, Spanish, French, any of those Romance languages, Germanic languages, it makes them feel so much easier because you get a break with every fifth word or whatever. It kind of makes a little bit of sense to you.
I'm reminded of an interview I had with Steve Kaufman, who's the linguist, speaks like almost 20 languages. Crazy, amazing guy. And he said that when you're picking up some sort of, Romance language or a Latin-based language, it says that you got about 20% of the words are freebies.
And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what is actually going on with Chinese, because it's not quite as simple as there are no cognates, and it obviously is not the same as learning Spanish. So let's talk a little bit about this.
And John, I mentioned cognates. You just mentioned them as well. We're going to talk about these a little bit on the show. So I think just give a quick definition about this, because I am not a linguist, if you will. I didn't study all this stuff, and I had to make sure I was totally clear on the definition. So just for anyone who wants to know, definition of a cognate, some people, there's some arguments on this, but basically it's the words from different languages that have similar spellings, pronunciations, or meanings. For example, the word accident in English is very similar to the word for accident in Spanish, which is, John?
Accidente.
So if you're learning Chinese, you're not going to have a lot of those, and the ones that do exist are, in my experience, not typically very helpful.
Okay, so this subject of cognates can be a little tricky, though. So let's look at the case of Chinese, where you might be unsurprised to learn that a lot of the words in modern Chinese come from ancient Chinese. So you got Old Chinese, you got Middle Chinese, and these words, they change a little bit over time, but they're carried down and they remain in the language in some form or another. So it's probably not too surprising. One thing that's kind of interesting is that classical Chinese was mostly one-syllable words, But now in modern Chinese, it's mostly two-syllable words. So you're still using the same building blocks, which you might think of as characters, but we're actually talking about words here. So these building blocks of words, the sounds, right? And they're combining and forming words in modern Chinese, over time.
So, John, that's actually interesting to me. I actually did not know that in more classical Chinese, words were basically one syllable. And I'm aware that in modern Chinese, we have two syllables frequently to represent a word. But why was it back then it was largely just one syllable word?
So why was ancient Chinese largely monosyllabic? I can't answer that question. I'm not an expert on ancient Chinese. And also a lot of stuff about language is arbitrary. Like, why is this word this? The arbitrariness of language is actually one of its key features. But the way that Chinese has evolved is also largely relevant to trying to avoid homophones so that meaning can be clear. So when you double up syllables, you can make your words, two syllables, meaning it's easy to differentiate them from similar.
Well, that makes sense.
Okay, but moving on from, ancient Chinese, China has had lots of historical interactions with other cultures, and not just recently, but, for a long time. So you have like the Silk Road, you have like all these Buddhist scriptures coming into China. You have like interactions with the Mongolians, the Manchurians. And so with all of these like major historical interactions, you're going to have language exchange, which is going to involve words coming into the language.
So I guess one question I have about that, John, is what were the key cultures that influenced the Chinese language? And I'll even say that knowing that there wasn't always necessarily a unified Chinese language in what we now consider modern-day China.
All right. Again, I'm not really an expert on ancient Chinese, but, with the Silk Road, you have like Persian culture, Buddhism, you have, Sanskrit. I'm sorry, I can't really say much about Buddhism. That's a very complex topic on its own. But, you got the Mongolian and the Manchurian cultures and their languages, so there's that.
So that we do know some of the areas where the influence is coming from.
Yeah, and I don't want to like just drop a bunch of random words that like no one's going to remember. But if you want to research it, you can find examples of this. Aside from those like foreign cultures coming into contact with the Chinese over the centuries, one really interesting source of new vocabulary in modern Chinese, and not just recently, but over the years for sure, is other dialects. So, you have Cantonese, you have Taiwanese, you have Beijing dialect, you have Shanghai dialect, you have Dongbei Hua, right? So you have all these dialects, and often those dialects have their own little quirky terms that come into the mainstream.
Yeah, this is something I have noticed over the years. Even Cantonese, shares the common written language, but just because the characters are all the same, that doesn't mean that things are said the same way in standard Mandarin Chinese as it is in Cantonese. And the same goes for Taishanese and Shanghainese, right? So that's something that I found that was really interesting to me. So even the same written language, but not the same.
Yeah, this is kind of interesting because it also kind of follows the fashion, like the trends of the time. Like when Hong Kong was like the coolest place in mainland China, or does that count as mainland China? Coolest place in that area, then you're going to have more words coming from Cantonese. Or when Shanghai becomes, so important and fashionable in the 1920s or whatever, then you're going to have more words coming from Shanghainese into Mandarin during that time. And the same goes for Taiwanese. And now recently with a lot of the internet slang, the internet is a more recent source of vocabulary. It's not because there's this new fashionable, prestigious dialect. It's because it sounds kind of funny or cute, and it just kind of goes viral.
This underlies a feature of the Chinese language, which I've always liked. I kind of do believe it somehow influences the culture a little bit, but it's that you want to make up a new word in Chinese. You can't really create a new character. It's like you have existing building blocks, and you take those blocks and you put those together in a different way to create a new meaning, a new word. Once again, obviously, a lot of that stuff is coming out the internet these days. Definitely, the Chinese culture, in my opinion, is very resourceful, and so is the language. You've got to work with what you got.
Yeah, it's really cool. So let's talk about loan words a little bit, and totally foreign loan words. There's two main ways that foreign words come into Chinese. You can try to transliterate them, so phonetically try to represent them in Chinese. And there are some examples of that. But then you can also take kind of the meaning of the original word and like bit of meaning gets translated into a character, which kind of means the same thing. And so you get a word that is totally Chinese, or at least it's going to sound Chinese to anyone who's maybe not Chinese, but it actually came in as a loan word. So to give like a really more recent example of that would be the Chinese name for Microsoft. So they took the word micro, or sorry, it's not a word. They took the prefix micro and they translated that into the Chinese prefix for micro. And then they took the word soft and translated that into soft. And then, when you hear it as an English speaker, it doesn't sound like anything if you don't know Chinese, but it actually is a sort of translation into Chinese from English.
So, John, these types of loan words, they're not necessarily a transliteration. It's actually perhaps translating the literal meaning of the word into Chinese. Is that right?
Right. But it's probably different from the way the Chinese themselves would come up with a word for this thing. But then you do have transliterations. There's a common example. It's probably one of the most common words you can think of, which is a transliteration. And that is the word for sofa, shafa,
yeah.
Right? And so it doesn't sound really like sofa. Like, it's like, couldn't you have gotten it closer? I know there's a Chinese syllable for so and a Chinese syllable for fa. So why is it shafa? So this one's kind of interesting because, as is the case with many loan words that come into Chinese, it actually didn't come straight into Chinese. It came into Shanghainese. And however they pronounce that in Shanghainese, sorry, I can't tell you. I only know a very limited amount of Shanghainese. It then got transliterated into Mandarin as shafa. So quite a few loan words are like that, especially the more recent ones. They come in through Cantonese, they come in through, like, I don't know, maybe Taiwanese, they come in through Shanghainese, and then they come into Mandarin. So it's not like a direct transliteration thing.
But there are some useful ones out there. But, there's ones like 可乐, for cola, and cafe for coffee. One, I wonder where this one still comes from, but 吐司 for toast, right?
Yep. Yeah, there's a ton of them. And it's not really a matter of whether they're useful or not. I mean, if that's the word people use, then that's the word you got to learn, right?
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to a sofa, that's basically the word. So if you got to learn it, you got to learn it. So you have like these ones that are kind of translated into a Chinese meaning, and then you have these ones that are transliterated, trying to represent the sounds in Chinese, whether or not it came directly from a foreign language or not. Like cafe came actually from Italian, apparently. But then there's ones that are a mix, and those are kind of fun, where like half the word is meaning, and then like the other half of the word is some part of the original foreign word. All these different kinds of like weird loan words, I think it really gives Chinese its distinct feeling and flavor.
Well, what would be an example of these, John?
Like the half and half ones. So one of the best examples, I think, that are pretty old and that you also learn fairly early on in your studies of Chinese is a lot of the country names. Not all of them. Like Yingguo, like it starts out sounding kind of like England, and then guo means country. Faguo, it starts sounding like France, but then it turns into the word for country in Chinese, Deguo. So it starts sounding like, Deutschland, but then you get the guo. So there are actually a lot of words like that. And you might not even realize that's what it is when you first learn it. But over time, as you really start to acquire the vocabulary and you learn groups of words that are similar, you start to draw these connections. And these are the things that cognates can't really help you with. But once you start understanding the underlying logic of Chinese, it really starts to gel.
I have to say, there's one word that seems to be very common and ubiquitous among many languages, and that's mama. That's how it is in Chinese. Mama, English, mama. And I know many other languages is also that way. So why is that, John? Please answer that for me.
Actually, there have been studies on that, and there are theories. I'm not really going to spout them, but I know they're out there, and it just has to do with the sounds that a child's mouth can make from the earliest ages, and just kind of gets associated that way.
Very cool.
All right, so one other example, which I think is a kind of special example and kind of interesting, is the example of Japanese, because the Japanese also use Chinese characters to write stuff, and so when the Chinese borrow from Japanese, and they have a fair amount, They're not borrowing the Japanese pronunciation for the most part. In recent years, they kind of have a bit more. But traditionally, they look at the characters the Japanese are using, and then they pronounce them in Chinese. And so an example of a loan word that came from Japanese, which you might not realize, is the word for telephone. Apparently, originally, the Chinese were going to try to transliterate telephone, telefeng or something like that. But they noticed the Japanese are using this word denhua, and they see the characters dianhua, electric speech, and they're like, yeah, we like that. That kind of makes more sense. 2 characters, fairly simple characters. Let's just do that. So that's the one that stuck.
I like that, John. I got to say, sometimes in my means, I do bag on Japan for stealing Chinese characters. It's all in good fun. It's cool.
Goes both ways, man.
But yeah, I had no idea. We got dianhua from Japanese because they were using those characters. How do they say it in Japanese again?
Denhua. Because the Japanese pronunciation for that word actually came from Chinese.
Wow. So we borrowed it back, right?
Oh, yeah. You want to get into Japanese and Chinese, there's lots of, stuff going back and forth all the time.
Fascinating.
So when we come to like modern internet slang, it's kind of a mixed bag of all this stuff. So you got all this new vocabulary, which sometimes doesn't last for more than like a year or a season or whatever. And a lot of it's coming from dialect. Some of it comes from intentionally mispronouncing a word as if you have the accent of another dialect and then writing it in different characters so that it seems like you have that accent. I don't know if you're following me. But internet slang borrows stuff from all these sources, and it does a lot more of the transliteration as well. So just borrowing the sounds.
And sometimes they just use straight up English words too.
That too. Or sometimes you can't tell whether they're like using characters or words. I mean, if you're reading it, you can tell. But so yeah, that's basically the crazy mixed bag of all the sources of Chinese words. It's not just ancient Chinese wisdom fermenting over time and turning into modern Chinese. There's lots of borrowing and different kinds of borrowing. And the more Chinese you learn, the more kind of sense it starts to make.
So, John, let's pull this all together. So what does this mean for all of our Chinese learners out there?
Well, if you're paying attention in the beginning, you should know that you should not expect lots of cognates like if you were learning a European language. So I hope that's obvious. And there may be some loan words, but they're probably not going to be super helpful because you still have to kind of learn the Chinese pronunciation, which, by the way, has tones. So you can't really put a lot of hope into cognates and loan words. But when you spend the time learning Chinese, and it's very enjoyable, of course, and you're accumulating all this Chinese vocabulary, then that hard work and all that memorization gives you all these building blocks. And then down the road, when you get to like intermediate and above, it all just starts to make sense and come together, and the vocabulary comes much more easily.
That's something I really do enjoy, John. I continue to learn, come across a new word. I know the 2 characters, but I don't know the word. But as I talk through it or read it in context, it makes sense.
Yeah, it's something that you really don't expect as a beginner. You have a lot of struggles learning all this vocabulary, but it does come eventually. So it's really cool when it does come.
So, John, are you saying that you can learn Chinese?
I am, Jared, and 2023 is an excellent year for it.
All right, now it's time for a word from our sponsor. And today our sponsor is
the All Set Learning Chinese Grammar Wiki.
This Chinese Grammar Wiki is the #1 resource for Chinese grammar on the internet.
Yep, you can find it by searching for Chinese Grammar Wiki. Grammar Wiki, Chinese, you can find it easily. And hey guys, it's free. You got grammar from beginner all the way to advanced. It's all online.
But that's not all, John. For those people who like to have print versions of this resource, is it available?
Yes, there are print versions. So you can buy a volume of this grammatical information about Chinese broken down by level. So we got the elementary, the intermediate, the upper intermediate. People find this really useful to have a print version, or you could get an ebook version as well.
Where can I find these, John?
Well, you can go to allsetlearning.com, and there is a link to the Chinese Grammar Wiki under resources. But if you just search for Chinese Grammar Wiki, you'll find it right away too.
For all your Chinese grammar needs, you can go check out the website, or you can go get that book today. Check it out.
You'll be glad you did.
All right, now it's time for rants and raves. John, what do you have for us today? Do you have a rant or do you have a rave?
I have a rant, little negative, but that's okay. A friend of mine was asking me on WeChat. He's like, "What do you do when you are trying to find a really obscure word that you just can't find?" He's like, "It's not in Pleco." Or it was in Pleco maybe, but it had no pinyin reading, which you sometimes come across that when you're looking for something really obscure. And it's true. Like Chinese has been an electronic language, for quite a while now. We're used to typing in it. We're used to copying and pasting text. But there are still cases where a character that doesn't seem that hard, like you just can't find it. And I'm sure that there are people listening to this podcast that are like, "Oh, I can find that." And maybe they can, but it's just not that easy. So like the character that we're talking about, if you have some character knowledge, the top of it is like a smushed shan, right, mountain. And then the bottom of it is the character for deer, Lu. And so that's the character. The components are quite obvious. You might guess that it's pronounced Lu or something, but it's still really hard to find and to be sure how to pronounce it. So that's my little rant. It's just annoying. I've been studying and teaching Chinese for quite a while, but I occasionally run into this stuff. And if you are quite knowledgeable about characters and you have some information for us on this, we would love to hear it. Maybe you have some kind of foolproof method of finding these obscure characters and figuring out the pinyin. That would be cool.
I got to say, John, if it's not in Pleco, I don't know what to do, man.
If it's not in Pleco, you probably don't need it, but sometimes you want to know.
Probably. Yeah. Run away scared.
All right, so Jared, do you have a rant or a rave?
John, I've got a rave today. This is something that just came out in the news last week, I believe, maybe 2 weeks ago. On a podcast back in November, I mentioned how I got to play pickleball with the China ambassador to the United States. It was totally random. He had a delegation coming here through Utah and had some mutual friends. And next thing I know, I was playing pickleball with this guy. Anyway, had a great experience. I wore my Chinese sweatshirt that says 跟我说中文. So, speak Chinese with me. It's from, you can get that on the Mandarin Companion merch website. But anyway, he was just promoted to be the foreign minister for China. And I was like, whoa. My friend messaged me about that. I was like, wow, that's kind of crazy. I'm used to having friends in low places, but got maybe a friend in high places.
A friend, though, or just a pickleball buddy?
Probably just a pickleball buddy. But we were on the same team, so...
Oh, okay.
But I did beat his wife in pickleball, but we did it together.
You beat someone's wife? Dude.
In a game, John.
All right.
Thankfully, we didn't create an international incident.
Hiya, I'm Krystal.
Krystal and I are in a WeChat group together, and she reached out to share her story.
By day, I'm a software engineer and also a Cantonese heritage speaker living in London. I started learning Mandarin about 2.5 years ago.
Knowing Cantonese definitely gives you an advantage when learning Mandarin Chinese, but Krystal's story illustrates that even so, we all still need to find our own reason to learn and put in the time to study and build proficiency. During our conversation, I also learned quite a few things about Cantonese along the way. Stay with us. Well, Krystal, why did you start learning Chinese?
Well, there was mostly two reasons. So first one is culture. Being a Cantonese heritage speaker, I actually was born in Guangzhou, and then I moved here when I was 6 years old. So all my family at home speaks Cantonese. Like, we're not really a Mandarin family, being in the southern parts of China. I was there till 6. Spoke Cantonese all the way, and then my grandfather actually taught me 1,000 characters by the time I was 6 years old, so I could read and write 1,000 traditional characters by the age of 6.
That's amazing.
I know. I couldn't believe
Wow.
that I actually did that. But my parents and my grandfather told me, yeah, back then that is what you did.
You don't remember that, though. Am I understanding correctly?
I do think that there is part of me that still remembers a lot of those characters because I don't find it too difficult to read traditional characters. So, yeah, I think some of it is still there.
Okay, you left at age 6. Dig back a little bit and help us understand, because a lot of people may not have this perspective and this experience on, well, you grew up in Guangzhou and you're speaking Cantonese, but why didn't you learn Mandarin? And it sounds like maybe they were teaching you Mandarin there. And for many of us who may not be familiar with this, maybe you could explain a little bit of the environment down there in Guangzhou at the time you were growing up, which I assume was maybe 20-something years ago?
I think at that time, All my family spoke Cantonese. Everyone around was Cantonese. Everyone in the streets spoke Cantonese. I don't know if there were many Mandarin speakers in the city at the time, but from what my mum told me was actually during when my parents were in primary school and high school, which is maybe 50 years ago now, they actually had Mandarin education. I think my mum said that around about 50 years ago was when they started changing all the schools to Mandarin education. So my mum said her primary school at the time was actually taught in Mandarin because I think the school was run by teachers from Shanghai. Then the school my father went to was actually taught in Cantonese. They both met at high school, and in their high school, that was when the government started to change and said it all had to be in Mandarin education. All lessons then was taught in Mandarin. But so for me, I think nursery must have been in slightly part of it might have been Mandarin because it would have been 20 years later. So they would have hardened this Mandarin education and made it a little bit more stricter.
That sounds about right, maybe according to some of my understandings. I had an assistant who was from Sichuan, and she said she didn't start learning Mandarin until she went to college. You know, she's about in her early 30s at this stage, so it may be a little bit similar situation. Over the many decades, there's been a large Chinese diaspora. Maybe you could share a little bit of that. Why did your parents leave China and come to the UK?
I'm not entirely sure the story, why they actually chose to leave. From what they've told me, they wanted to leave for a better life. Because at that time in China, things were quite corrupt and it was difficult to run your own business, and China was still quite a poor country. We were not exactly a super wealthy family or anything like that. We didn't have a lot of money. So they just wanted to move to a different country for a better life, because a lot of people back then perceived that, okay, moving to somewhere like America, Australia or UK would definitely provide a better life. And currency back then was also higher as well. The pound to the RMB was way, way higher back then. So £1 could get you a lot of stuff in China, whereas now obviously you can't now. For them, they just want a better life for me and my sister as well.
So now tell me about this. You moved to the UK. You're a 6-year-old little girl, and I'm assuming that your level of English at that time is probably not very high, if at all.
Probably zero. From what I remember, I attended primary school. So in the UK, proper formal education starts at age of 6. And I think at that time, if I remember, I didn't know anything. I don't even remember if I knew ABCDs. I was just thrown into this situation where I couldn't understand anything from the teachers, from my schoolmates. I knew nothing. Luckily, my mum at the time found a private tutor who was willing to help me. And we would meet her at a local library every single week, and she taught me from ABCs and then sounds, and then taught me to read words and taught me to spell. If I remember, it was very crazy. But as a child, you just pick them up really quickly. I think after a few years, I was fine, I think.
Wow, that's great. Now, tell me a little bit about what progressed in the story here, because we still haven't got to the point of where you've decided, hey, I want to learn Mandarin Chinese, Putonghua, right? Maybe you could tell me a little bit about growing up here in the UK and to the point where you said, hey, I really want to learn this language.
Yeah, so I went to Chinese school on Saturdays through most of my educational life. I chose to learn that in Cantonese, so I didn't learn any Mandarin until recently. And then I stopped when I was 16, didn't do anything related to Chinese besides watching TV. I did actually get into watching Hong Kong TV shows, and I pretty much religiously watched that for several years, all of it in Cantonese. Here and there, I dipped into some Mandarin shows, but not really much. I never had much of an interest. I actually did try for many years between then and now to try to learn to read, because I felt, I learned it all these years, but I've kind of dropped it and I haven't done anything with it. But I've never had the motivation. I never had the reason to learn, because in my day-to-day life, I had no usage for it. I had no usage for work, and I could speak to my parents in Cantonese, so there was no need for Mandarin. There was also no need for anything written. It's just something I didn't do. Then about 2.5 years ago, I just randomly discovered this TV show called The Untamed on Netflix. It's a mainland TV show, and I was like shocked. I was like, I didn't know there were mainland TV shows on Netflix. Let me give this a go. Watched it and was completely fascinated by the TV show. Then I found that it was adapted from a web novel called 魔道主师. So then I went and read at that time, which was the only available fan translation of the web novel. It's been so popular now, it's now got an official English translation. So that I read all the fan translation. I was like, wow, this is so good. Found that this author had also written another book called 天光赐福, and I read that in a fan translation and was absolutely in love with that book. So then afterwards, I was like, I felt I really wanted to read this in the original language. So sometime in May 2020, I called up my mum and was like, Mum, I really want to learn to read Chinese in Mandarin. And then could you, I don't know, help me? At that time, I had no idea how to even start. So I thought maybe my mum could help me because my mum can speak Mandarin. I still remember very clearly on the 20th of May 2020, me and my mum started my Chinese lessons, which was very simple. My mum would read some simple Chinese children's books. Just slowly she'll read the text and then I will follow along and repeat after her. And then slowly I went online and found out different tips to learn the language, and then I slowly improved over time.
When she was reading it, was she reading it in Cantonese or in Mandarin Chinese?
It was in Mandarin Chinese.
Okay, so your mom does speak Mandarin Chinese.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So that's actually really important. So what was kind of her level, I guess your parents' level of Mandarin at that point?
So for her, her primary school and secondary school was all taught in Mandarin, and a few of her friends in school was only spoke Mandarin. I think quite a few of them were from Shanghai. So her Mandarin level is much better than my father, who only started learning Mandarin in secondary school. She could definitely survive in China, no problem, and she could read and write, no problem, all in Mandarin. And she actually reads subvocally in Mandarin because that's what she was taught from a young age, although she speaks Cantonese like at home and to her family and friends.
And maybe you could unpack this a little bit for some of us who aren't familiar. In fact, I got to admit, my familiarity with Cantonese is not very high. They share the same written language, although a Cantonese typically will use traditional characters, right? But you could take a same text and you could read it in Mandarin or Cantonese. But what is kind of the difference between those two in your experience in like the word usage, and how similar are they and how different are they in the written language?
If it's written in just standard written Chinese without any sort of slang or modern day terminologies or very like internet type terminologies, then you can read it in both Mandarin and Cantonese and it will be the same meaning. But with spoken wise, Cantonese is very different from the way it's written.
Interesting.
So from a reading point of view, if you were to read the written text in Cantonese, it's actually very confusing because it doesn't sound anything like the spoken language. So for native Cantonese, those from Hong Kong, have almost two languages in their head, the spoken version of Cantonese and the written version. And they said that sometimes they would actually just read the written version like it is spoken, or sometimes they'll read it as it is, but in their heads, they've just adapted all these years and they've just been able to understand and translate it into the spoken version. But with Mandarin, what is spoken and what is written is generally the same.
Wow, that's really interesting. You know, we oftentimes talk about how the written version of a language is different than the oral version of a language, and we definitely have that as well in English. And, you know, there's some words and phrases which are more written than spoken, but it sounds like in Cantonese, there can be a very large gap between those two.
Yeah, it is. It is so different that I actually started learning to read in Cantonese before I decided to move to Mandarin. And when I was reading all these texts in Cantonese, it just felt like a foreign language to me. And then I thought, if I am learning this and it feels foreign, why don't I just learn it in Mandarin? Because with Mandarin, the written and spoken is so similar that it feels more natural and it flows much better. And then, of course, like, because I want to read content that are written by mainland authors, there will be slang or modern day sort of terminologies that only exist in the Mandarin language. So it would make much more sense to read it in Mandarin.
So you say, okay, I'm going to learn Mandarin Chinese. You turn to your mom. Your mom's helping you out. She's reading along with you, I guess, helping you out here. But, like, what were you doing? Because, I mean, there's one thing of just, okay, you see the character, but the sounds are different, and I'm sure maybe some of the meaning's a little different than what you might anticipate. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, how you started connecting all the dots and how Cantonese helped you learn Mandarin.
So yeah, there are definitely vocabulary that are the same, like particularly objects and nouns. Some of the adverbs I've noticed are a little bit different, but I would reckon that maybe about 20 to 30% of the words actually sound very similar. Like I can give you a very simple example. So for example, apple in Mandarin is 苹果, and then in Cantonese is 苹果. So you can see it is very similar. It's just a slight tone difference, and quite a lot of words are like that. So when I first started learning Mandarin, it helped me with listening. Firstly, Cantonese is also a tonal language, so the tonal part of Mandarin wasn't as difficult as it would be for someone who comes from a non-tonal language. It still took me maybe about 3 to 4 months to really get tones right and to hear them. So sometimes when I watch very simple contents like children's cartoon like Peppa Pig, sometimes I could just work out what they're saying based on the few words that I can hear because they are similar to Cantonese. So that helped me with my kind of listening. It kind of gave me a head start in listening.
Can definitely understand that. You say you take you 3-4 months to get your tones right. I feel like, after 10 years, I'm still trying to get my tones right.
Yeah, that is one of the advantages of coming from another Chinese dialect learning Mandarin because they are all tonal.
Definitely a big benefit there. Well, of course, we've talked a little bit how Cantonese helped you, right, in learning Mandarin. But what were some of the challenges or difficulties that you encountered in learning Mandarin?
One of the hardest parts about knowing a very similar language to Mandarin is that it is too similar sometimes, and my brain sometimes get confused between the two, particularly when I'm speaking. Even now, I still muddle up between the two, and it's something that it's so challenging to get over because I've spoken Cantonese for so many years, almost every day with my parents growing up and watching TV, etc. Then suddenly having to say almost the same thing but using a different sound, it's very, very challenging, and my mind sometimes just can't comprehend the two, and I would easily get mixed up. And I think this is something that would take me a very long time to get over, or to be able to. I think I will still make mistakes even for years to come. I will probably still make many, many mistakes because I'm just so used to Cantonese, and having to switch it to Mandarin, it's very hard when speaking, that is. But for reading and listening, it's not an issue. It's just when speaking.
Good problems to have.
I worry that sometimes people say, "Oh, it's always easier for those that know Cantonese," but actually, we have our own challenges. So maybe a good one to fit in. It's not always an advantage.
My response to that would be like, well, that's good to know. That's not smooth sailing for all you Cantonese speakers, right? You still have challenges like us, you native English speakers, but still, it makes sense. I think learning any language from any angle, there's going to be challenges. So it sounds like this initial motivation though was to read some of these stories that you were reading in English, or you were reading the translated version, say, hey, maybe I want to go back and read it in Mandarin now, and maybe I'm ready to learn Mandarin. But it sounds like there's maybe a larger reason behind there. What are some of these other reasons or motivations you really said, hey, I'm going to dive in and really start learning Mandarin now?
Partly would probably be cultural. I've always loved historical China. I absolutely love the way they dress, all of the sort of mannerisms, the buildings, everything. I just think it's just fascinating, and it's something unique to ancient China. So for me, the biggest motivation is not just to read web novels or to read novels, it's to actually read novels set in ancient China, with these like beautiful people wearing beautiful long robes and long hair and these really nice, gorgeous, large, majestic looking buildings. For me, it connects well as well because a lot of the cultural parts that you see in some of these books and some of these TV shows, it's felt like it's part of me. For example, in China, it's very common knowledge that they preferred men over women for many, 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 many years. And it's very, very obvious in TV shows, especially in historical TV shows. There's always this men status and women status is down here. Men is up there, women is down here. And it's just when I watch these kinds of TV shows, I feel very connected to them because although it wasn't really pushed upon me because I grew up in a more modern era and things have slightly changed, but there was still definitely some of it when I grew up that, because I'm a girl, I am expected to do these things and I'm expected to go take this path just because I'm female. So then in some of these TV shows and stories, a lot of the times they want to push these female boundaries and write stories about women in historical times that push boundaries. And it felt for me, it just feels very relatable, and I just feel connected to these, which I don't find in Western literature, because for me, I am Chinese, so this is my culture.
Mm, I can see that. I'm curious to know also, growing up in the UK, but being culturally Chinese and growing up in a Chinese family, what were some of those gender role pressures that you encountered that perhaps you pushed back against maybe when you got older?
So from young, my parents wanted me to be a doctor. Like every Chinese parents would want their children to be a doctor. The typical one is a doctor and a lawyer. And don't get me wrong, doctors and nurses are great. I mean, they save people's life, but it just wasn't something that I was interested in. And also, I don't think I was academically capable. I did well in maths, but maths alone is not enough to get you a doctor's degree. I just wasn't that interested in science, and I was actually really interested in computer science, which at the time was like very groundbreaking, especially for women as well. Like there's not many people that would study computer science at that time, especially not female. So I said to my parents that I wanted to study computer science. My God, it didn't go down very well, unfortunately. So they were like, no, you're not going to get a career in this. This is not for you. You need to, consider some other role. Like my parents at that time knew that I couldn't academically get a doctor's degree, so they were giving up on the idea, but they wanted to try and get me into something like accountancy or something they thought would be suitable for me, but it just didn't appeal to me at the time. But I loved computers and I just wanted to code because I was building pretty websites at the time in my own bedroom. I just wanted to carry on with that. So that was for me like pushing the boundaries and expectations of what my parents and family wanted, because it wasn't just my parents that was involved in this. My extended family got involved in this, and I had calls from aunties from China, aunties from America, saying that, oh, maybe you should consider a different career path. And I was just like, no, I wanted to study computer science. I'm going to sign up for this course, and you can't stop me. I was a very rebellious child. Well, here we are. I am now a software engineer. So at that time, it was a rebellious move. And actually, my parents now don't regret that either, because they see that we now live in a digital age with so much technology around us, and they know that the career path of the software engineer is a very bright and wonderful one.
Definitely. And I applaud you for that. I think women are still underrepresented in computer science, so that's fantastic. I'm curious to know what the perception was of your parents and even extended family, it sounds like, when you decided to say, hey, I'm going to start learning Mandarin.
My mom was over the moon. She was so happy. She was like, I told you so many years ago. She wanted me to carry on. She wanted me to learn. And when we first moved to the UK, my mom actually gave me two options. She said, I'm going to enroll you to Chinese school. There is no option. I have to attend. She said to me, do you want to learn Mandarin or do you want to learn Cantonese? Being 6 years old, I had no idea the difference between Cantonese or Mandarin, and I had already started Cantonese education. I just wanted to carry on because there's something I already knew. I didn't really want to learn something new. It sounded really hard, so I stuck with Cantonese. But for years and years and years, my mom wanted me to switch to Mandarin. She was like, oh, it's so much better if you learn Mandarin. You've got pinyin, it's so much easier. You learn simplified, it's less strokes, and when you're reading a book, it makes more sense because it's the same as spoken. Being a child, I didn't understand any of this. I didn't know what any of this really meant. And besides, I didn't want to learn Chinese when I was a child and a teenager. I had to attend Saturday school when none of my friends did.
The dreaded Saturday school. I have yet to really talk to a Chinese heritage learner who didn't attend those weekend classes.
It's extremely difficult for me back then too, because back then UK wasn't as multicultural as it is now. There were not as many young children, especially from different cultures. So none of my friends attended this language Saturday school. I was the only one. So everyone on Saturdays would go to the cinema, would go out, and it's me having to go to Chinese school every single Saturday. And then have to do extra homework. What child wants to do extra homework? Every single week I had extra homework, I had dictation. Then I had an extra exam more than everybody else. So when I told my mum I want to learn Mandarin, my mum said, "Oh my gosh, finally! It only took so many years to convince you that you should learn Mandarin, and it is worth it."
That's great. I'm curious to know, like, how has learning Mandarin, has it had any impact on your life or even impact on your relationships with your family?
It's definitely improved my relationship with my parents. So some things that have improved from a day-to-day life is I can now text my parents in Chinese. Before we
Mm.
used to use just voice messaging. So that's made a massive improvement, just being able to text each other in Chinese. And then my dad also
Mm.
texts me sometimes if he needs anything, because he's not that savvy with the phone. He doesn't really know how to use
Mm-hmm.
it. So, but he knows how to text. So that really helps. And something like that I never did in the past. I never text parents. We just send voice messages. I've also made a lot of friends online. So I joined a
Oh.
Discord community
Mm-hmm.
called 看剧学汉语. The entire Discord community is mostly full of people who want to learn or who are learning Chinese through media, mostly through watching TV shows, listening to audiobooks, audio dramas, and reading books. I've just met so many amazing, wonderful people from around the world. Because we all share the same interests, we almost talk every single day, and it's amazing. Quite a few of them, I'll probably be friends with them for the rest of my life. This is a journey that we've taken together, and it's a journey that we will continue to share for many, many years to come.
Wow, that's really neat. That sounds like a special thing. And I was curious, like, your parents, do they speak English? What is their English level as well?
My dad's English is a little bit better than my mum's English, but they can get by. Like, they can have some very basic conversation, very, very basic conversation with somebody that can only speak English. But they couldn't watch a TV show and completely understand it. They couldn't watch a movie even.
Mm-hmm.
My dad would just fall asleep whenever he watches any English films because he can't understand any of it.
I get that now, why texting has had that big impact on your relationship with your family, because it's just one more mode of communication that you can do to connect with your parents. So I also understand, Krystal, that you've been involved in putting together some Chinese learning resources for Chinese learners.
I'm part of a Discord community full of learners who are learning Chinese through different forms of Chinese media. So when I first discovered this Discord, there were lots and lots of people looking for native Chinese media recommendations, mostly around TV shows and books. So we had a spreadsheet full of this list of different types of TV shows they can watch, different books they can consume, and eventually the list got quite big. Learners weren't just looking for media, they were also looking for general learner resources. For example, which graded reader to read, what learner content are out there. So one day I just thought, let's put together a list of different recommendations for different levels. So from intermediate to sort of upper intermediate to sort of advanced. The document was mainly for reading because that was my expertise at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then a few of us put this huge document together, and we called it Heavenly Path because it was a reference to sort of Chinese fantasy. It's like a path with a lot of Chinese fantasy stories, particularly wuxia and xianxia story. It will start from sort of someone. It's mostly the story about someone who's very weak, and then they would level up and get stronger and stronger and stronger, and then get to the very end. And this was the idea of the guide, which was someone starting from the beginner level Chinese and slowly progressing and getting to their final goal of being able to read native content. So we put all of that together, and over time we developed it, and eventually now, as it is, it's now not just a guide for reading, we also have guides for listening as well. We also have lots of recommendations on different books they can read, and it's all ranked by different levels. Because we found that there's just not enough content out there for a learner to bridge the gap between the sort of learner content and native content. The gap between the hardest content for learner and the easiest sort of native content, the gap is still huge at the moment.
Yeah, it sure is.
The goal of this site is to give them some suggestion on slightly easier native content that they can sort of dive into to help them bridge the gap between very difficult learner content and sort of the more difficult native content, like some of the bigger web novels or some of the novels that they want to read or some of the TV shows they want to watch.
Yeah, well, that's great. That's great. And so it sounds like there's a whole lot of things that are available on that site. It's not just been yourself, it's been a number of people have contributed to that, right?
Yes, there's 5 of us that are mainly contributing to it. But then everyone in the Discord that we are also part of are also helping. They sometimes suggest things as well. They will tell us, oh look, I've read this novel, or I've seen this show that is quite good. It seems very easy. Could you have a look, and would it fit with this sort of level? And we would then have a look and see, oh, this is perfect for intermediate. It's very easy language. It's day-to-day words, and then we would then put it up onto the website.
Wow, that's amazing. Where can people go if they want to find out a little more about that? What's the website?
The website is heavenlypath.org.
Heavenlypath.org. Okay, that's pretty easy. Well, Krystal, this has been great, I think, to hear a lot of your perspectives on things. But what advice would you give to someone who's just starting to learn Chinese right now?
My top advice would be to start listening as soon as possible. I noticed that many learners go for let me just learn characters, learn to read, learn to recognize, and then learn to speak, or they learn the pinging, but actually they always neglect listening. And I find that listening is such an important skill, because not only does listening help you with remembering words, but you can also acquire new words from just consuming listening material, whether it is material for learners or native material. It's such a great way to acquire and retain vocabulary.
Listening is definitely critical, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely something that everyone should start incorporating as early as possible in their study, and don't neglect it, because just listening is hard. Reading and listening are the 2 passive skills, and listening is by far the harder of the 2, especially for those that are coming from a non-tonal language. It takes a long time to hear those tones. It takes a long time for the brain to adapt to not just the tones, but also the sound. When you first start, everything would just sound like a blur. You won't be able to tell the difference between the beginning and the end of a word. You just can't tell where things start, where things end. It's all just a massive blur, plus all this tone that's going up and down. It's all crazy. So listen, and eventually your brain will start to adapt, and we'll start to hear these individual sounds, and we'll start to be able to tell the difference between the tones. It is a little bit weird for me to say this, because for me it didn't take that long, and I know that for others this could take many months, or maybe even several years. But it's still something that is doable, and I've seen many people that are not native Cantonese speakers or native of other Chinese dialects have successfully got to a very high level of listening by simply listening a lot and consuming lots of content every single day for many months.
I think you mentioned something key there is as you spending lots of time. That's one of the key things that any language is. Takes effort, takes the time investment in all the areas that can really help your language skills grow. Well, Krystal, I really appreciate you taking the time to share your story and your experience with me and with all of our listeners out there. This has been really insightful for me and filled in some knowledge and understanding of the differences and the similarities of these 2 languages that I don't have deep expertise in.
Thanks a lot. It's been great being on this. It's been an amazing experience, and I absolutely love sharing my knowledge and experience.
You have been listening to the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. Help us spread the word by sharing this with your friends, classmates, teachers, cousins, executive director, minister, traveler, decorator, painter, and that one gal named Francine. You can subscribe in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And please write us a review so we know how we're doing. You can find us on Facebook and at MandarinCompanion.com, or tag us on social media, #MandarinCompanion. Apologies to John Cena, we just ran out of time. The You Can Learn Chinese podcast is produced by myself, Jared Turner, and our editor for this episode is actually myself, Jared Turner, and our interview editor is Dominic Edgley. I'd like to thank our special guest, Krystal Wu, and of course thanks to my co-host, the man, the myth, the legend, John Paston. See you next time.